The first time she said, "No one wants to date me," she laughed like it was a joke she had told too many times. I almost answered on autopilot, ready with the usual lines people throw out when they do not know what else to say. "That can't be true. You're amazing. It's their loss." But she did not give me the chance. She checked the empty parking lot with a quick glance, took a slow breath, and in one decisive movement lifted her shirt just enough to reveal the mark that, according to her, explained everything. In that instant, the cold night seemed to stop moving. It was not what cruel imaginations would invent. There was nothing cheap or indecent about it. It was a scar, thick, uneven, old. A piece of skin that had healed in the only way it knew how after something violent had interrupted her life. I could see that the wound that had left that line across her body no longer burned in the flesh, but it was very much alive in the way her fingers trembled while she held the fabric, in the way her eyes waited for me to react, as if she knew the ending of this scene. I could have turned away. I could have stared at the asphalt, mumbled something like, "It's not that bad," made a clumsy joke to smooth things over, like most people do when they are uncomfortable with someone else's pain. That is what the world had done to her for years. Change the subject, minimize, pretend not to see. But something inside me refused to repeat that pattern. I took a step closer, kept my eyes on her face and not on the mark, and heard myself say, slowly and clearly, "I'm not going anywhere." She froze. It was not the reaction she expected. The script she had learned by heart said that this was the moment the other person would pull back, hesitate, become distant, vanish behind an elegant excuse. Instead, I stayed right there in front of her. That night, under a tired streetlight, and with that secret exposed between us, something shifted. We did not know it yet, but the story really begins there, in the space between a scar, a sentence, and a promise no one had ever made to her before. If you stay until the end, you might discover that what was written on her skin was only the opening chapter of a much larger mystery. At work, Elena was the reference name people used when they wanted to describe someone reliable. Projects that mattered somehow always ended up in her hands. She was the one who arrived on time, who remembered deadlines without alarms, who kept meetings from turning into chaos. New hires watched her in meetings and whispered things like, "I hope I can be that put together someday." To most of the office, she was competence in human form. From a distance, her life looked simple and stable. Good job, solid reputation, a calm kind of authority that did not need to shout. She dressed with the same precise balance every day, professional but not stiff, elegant without trying to impress. If you looked only at her performance, you would say she was exactly where she was meant to be, climbing a corporate ladder with no time for distractions. As far as anyone could tell, nothing really touched her. Nothing shook her. But the things you notice when you stay late are different from what you see between 9 and 5. I often worked overtime, and in those quieter hours it was easier to catch the details that did not fit the heroic image. The way she always chose the back row when there was a team photo, angling her torso just slightly away from the camera. How she consistently avoided conversations about summer trips to the beach or pool days, quickly redirecting the topic to work whenever someone mentioned swimsuits or sun. Then there were the moments when talk turned to relationships. The office loved gossiping about proposals, breakups, dates that went badly and crushes that might turn into something. Whenever that happened, Elena's expression shifted in a way most people missed. It was not annoyance. It was more like someone bracing for an impact they had taken too many times. She would sip her coffee, draw a small smile, and let others talk while she carefully removed herself from the center of the conversation. Over time, she and I developed a quiet partnership. We worked together on difficult accounts, shared late evening coffees in the break room, exchanged small jokes that would make no sense to anyone else. It was a subtle bond, built more on what we did not say than on what we said out loud. Even so, there was a line she never let me cross. There was a part of her life she kept locked away, as if it lived in another country entirely. I did not know yet that the key to that locked place ran straight across her skin. The first hint I got about her life outside the office came in the form of a casual comment over stale coffee. A coworker was laughing about a bizarre message she had received on a dating app, passing her phone around so others could read it. Someone turned to Elena and asked if she used those apps. She answered with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I tried them once. Consider it research I don't need to repeat." Everyone laughed, satisfied with the witty answer. I didn't. Pieces of her story began to surface in fragments, never in a straight line. I heard about a dinner that had ended abruptly for no apparent reason, about someone who had been very interested, very present, and then fell silent without explanation, about conversations that started with enthusiasm and faded into short replies and then nothing at all. There were no loud arguments, no dramatic betrayals, just a series of exits disguised as courtesy. The sentences used were always carefully wrapped, as if kindness could soften the impact. You deserve someone better. I'm not in the right place for a relationship. You're wonderful, but I don't want to hurt you. On paper, they sounded noble. In practice, they traced the same shape over and over, like footsteps wearing a groove into stone. For Elena, these repeating endings were not random. They felt like evidence. She started to see logic in the heartbreaks. With the same analytical mind she used to solve work problems, she replayed each story and marked the moment when faces stiffened a little, when bodies tensed, when distance crept in. Those internal notes eventually converged on one conclusion. Sooner or later, the scar would enter the room, sometimes visible, sometimes only imagined, and everything would shift. Nobody said that directly. They did not need to. She felt it. In response, she did the one thing she knew how to do better than anyone. She adjusted. If love felt like a shaky investment, she poured herself into the place where she did have control, her job. She became even more indispensable, even more efficient, even more flawless. On Fridays, when others left early for dates, dinners, or drinks, she stayed back, rearranging folders and cleaning her inbox as if the silence of the office was a conscious preference, not the safest way to avoid yet another disappointment. Soon colleagues began to sum up her life with phrases that sounded almost admiring. Elena isn't interested in that romantic drama. She's married to her career. She doesn't need anybody. They thought they were complimenting her strength. They did not realize they were narrating the story exactly as she feared it was, a story where she was always too much, or not enough, for anyone to stay. The night everything cracked open started with a corporate celebration. The company had landed a big client, and management chose a high-end restaurant for the occasion. Soft lighting, polished glass, pointless decorative cutlery. Elena absolutely had to be there. Her work was one of the reasons the contract existed. I was invited too, more as part of the team than as any kind of protagonist. From the moment we walked in, I could tell something was off in her posture. Her dress was impeccable, dark and understated, but her hands kept returning to the fabric at her waist as if checking that it covered exactly what it needed to. When the director raised a glass to toast everyone's effort, a few eyes slid toward Elena with genuine respect. She smiled correctly, nodded at the compliments, but her gaze looked like it was fixed on a point just past the candlelight. Halfway through the evening, he appeared, the kind of man who walks as if every chair belongs to him, wearing a suit that seems to insist on being noticed. I didn't know who he was at first. I understood when I saw Elena's shoulders tighten. It was in the stillness that took over her body, the way she pulled her expression into something that looked like a mask. He reached our table with a familiar smile that somehow felt sharp. "Long time," he said, leaning in just a fraction too much. Facing the curious eyes of our colleagues, he added, "I still can't believe how someone can waste so much potential." The words were ambiguous enough to be defended later, but loaded enough to draw blood now. Conversations at nearby tables slowed. People pretended not to listen, which meant they were listening to every syllable. What followed was a string of innocent comments about how complicated it had been to date someone so reserved, so full of unresolved issues. He dressed his cruelty in jokes, shaped his judgments as anecdotes. Elena answered with measured sarcasm, defending herself without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her hurt. To an outsider, it might have looked like playful banter between exes. To anyone actually paying attention, it was a carefully public humiliation. The dinner eventually moved on. The waiters brought dessert, and laughter returned to the room in waves. But something in her had fallen silent. The restaurant lights remained warm. The music stayed soft, and yet the distance behind her eyes had grown deeper. When we finally stepped out onto the street, the night air felt colder than it should, as if carrying the echoes of everything he had suggested without ever saying it outright. We walked for a while without direction, just following the sidewalk away from the restaurant and its polished false cheer. The city hummed around us, car engines, distant voices, the occasional siren. But between us there was only a tight, heavy quiet. I was searching for something harmless to say when she laughed abruptly, a short sound that held no humor. "You know what the funniest part is?" she said, eyes fixed on the pavement. "I keep seeing people act surprised when things end the same way every time. I'm not surprised anymore." I asked her what she meant. She stopped under a streetlight, crossed her arms, and let the words fall out as if they had been waiting at the edge of her tongue for years. "No one wants to date me," she said matter-of-factly, not as a plea for reassurance, not as a dramatic confession, as if she were reading a result from a spreadsheet. I opened my mouth to contradict her, but she raised a hand. "Please don't," she murmured. "Don't tell me it's not true, that I just haven't met the right person, that people are stupid. I know the pattern. I know exactly where it shifts." Her fingers found the hem of her shirt almost on their own. Instinctively, I wanted to tell her she didn't have to show me anything. But this was not about my comfort. It was about the script her life had drilled into her. She glanced around, confirming that we were alone in the pool of yellow light, then lifted her shirt just enough for me to see. The scar crossed her torso like a fault line. It was not small. It did not hide easily. The skin there was tight and pale compared to the rest, a map of something fierce that had once tried to break her. "This," she said quietly, "is when they start to pull away. Sometimes I show it. Sometimes they just sense that there's something underneath, something they don't want to deal with. They become polite, careful, distant." She lowered the fabric again with a practiced motion, as if she had done it many times before. Shame, anger, exhaustion, it was all there, swirling in her expression. I knew the phrases people usually reached for. "It's not that bad. Anyone worth it won't care. You're still beautiful." But I could see in her face how many times those lines had already been handed to her and how little they had helped. So instead, I held her gaze, stepped just a little closer so she would not feel exposed in the open air, and said, "I'm not going anywhere." Not as a grand declaration, not as a promise I did not intend to keep, but as a simple truth in that moment. She looked at me as if I had just spoken a language she wasn't sure she understood. The silence between us changed. It became less like emptiness and more like a space where something new could exist. Neither of us knew yet how much that sentence would be tested. For now, it was enough that it had been said. I did not push her for explanations right then. The scar was not an invitation for curiosity. It was a boundary she had chosen to cross in front of me. So I just walked beside her, leaving room if she wanted to speak and room if she didn't. Eventually, she did. Maybe it was the late hour, or the fact that we were no longer inside the office roles, or the simple relief of having shown the thing she always hid. "It was an accident," she began, then paused, as if the word were too small. She went on to describe a day years before we had ever met, a day that began normally and ended with sirens, hospital lights, and a team of doctors fighting to keep her alive. The exact circumstances didn't matter as much as what came after: surgeries, bandages, endless examinations, and, finally, the moment the bandages came off and she faced the new landscape of her own body. "Surviving should have been enough," she said. But survival came with a second layer of struggle, people's reactions. Some looked at her with pity, their eyes heavy with, "I'm so sorry," even when they said nothing. Others offered awkward compliments that sounded like apologies. "At least your face is fine. Luckily you can cover it with clothes. No one will notice if you don't mention it." Few people looked at her as if she were simply herself, not a fragile object that had been cracked. Her first serious relationship after the accident ended soon after the scar was revealed. The breakup message did not mention it, of course. It hid behind phrases about timing and stress and not being ready. But she remembered the shift in his gaze the moment he saw that line on her torso. She remembered how his touch became more careful, how his desire turned into concern. After that, every reaction layered on top of the last, until the scar stopped being just tissue and turned into a story about being unlovable. "I started believing I had to compensate for existing," she said, fingertips grazing the fabric over the scar. "If someone stayed, it would be despite this. So I made sure to give them 100 other reasons to stay. Be good enough, useful enough, perfect enough." The office version of her finally made sense. The one who never missed a deadline, never left a loose end, never allowed herself to be just human. Perfection was not a personality trait. It was armor. I listened without offering any of the classic slogans people lean on around trauma. I did not tell her everything happened for a reason. I did not insist that the right person would see her differently. I just told her that what had happened to her and what she had survived was part of her story, not the definition of her value. She went home that night with the same scar, the same memories, the same world that had taught her to hide. But she also left knowing that at least one person had seen everything she was willing to show and had not run. I did not yet understand how much I owed her long before that conversation. The days that followed felt strangely normal at first. We went back to our routines, emails, meetings, spreadsheets, as if nothing extraordinary had happened in a dark parking lot. She did not mention the scar again, and I did not bring it up. But the air between us had changed. There was a new layer under every casual exchange, an awareness that we now shared something that no one else at the office knew. I stayed consistent. I crossed her path for coffee breaks, included her in planning sessions, sent her memes at odd hours when work got heavy. Nothing dramatic or romantic, just presence. I thought maybe, with enough time, she would begin to believe that my "I'm not going anywhere" was real. Then came Monday. The office fell off as soon as I walked in. Murmurs, phones held at strange angles, people who looked at their screens and quickly turned them off when someone approached. A weird, guilty energy hung over the open space. When I checked my inbox, I understood why. An anonymous email had been forwarded through several internal chains. Attached was a grainy photo, taken from afar, of Elena adjusting her shirt near the restaurant parking lot. The image was poorly lit and blurry, but someone had zoomed in just enough to suggest the outline of a scar beneath the fabric. The caption read, "Some things are harder to keep covered, huh?" No name, no direct insult, just enough insinuation to be cruel. A few people had already deleted it, unwilling to be part of whatever this was. Others had kept it, some out of curiosity, some out of the darker impulse that feeds on other people's vulnerability. No one would admit to forwarding it, but the email threads told the story on their own. When Elena arrived, she clearly already knew. Her face was composed, her clothes meticulously chosen, her posture upright. She did not storm into any office, did not demand answers. She sat down, turned on her computer, and began to work, the same efficiency as always, only sharper, more controlled. The only thing that betrayed her were her eyes, which had gone quieter, like a door shutting from the inside. I went to her desk, ignoring the glances that followed me. I told her about the email, though I knew she had seen it, and said we could talk to HR, find out who had sent it, make sure there were consequences. She listened, then asked in a flat tone, "And how long do you think you'll want to stand next to someone who drags around this kind of drama?" That question carried more weight than any rumor. My promise was being measured now, not against a private confession, but against public ridicule. The company eventually sent out a formal message condemning harassment and the sharing of private images. They said all the right things about respect and privacy, but internal memos do not erase the sting of whispered jokes or the feeling of being watched. For Elena, the email confirmed what she already believed, that her scar was not just on her body, it had a way of staining everything around her. And now, I was standing close enough to be marked too. Behind that anonymous cruelty, there was intent. Mobs rarely form out of nowhere. Someone lights the first match. When I tried to trace the path of the email, one name kept appearing at the beginning of the threads: Marcos. He had been competing with Elena for a promotion for months. On the surface, he was the picture of corporate charm, always ready with a joke, eternally helpful, the kind of person who remembers birthdays and forwards inspirational quotes to the whole team. He was also at that restaurant the night the photo was taken. He moved easily between tables, laughing with managers, filling glasses, joining conversations. If anyone had both motive and opportunity to snap a picture and send it into the company bloodstream, it was him. And yet, when the official memo about harassment went out, Marcos was the loudest voice of outrage. "I can't believe someone would do this," he said in the break room, his tone thick with moral indignation. "We're a team. We're supposed to protect each other." The performance might have convinced most people. It did not convince me. The more he talked about respect, the more rehearsed it sounded. I noticed how often he slipped Elena's name into conversation, pretending concern. "Have you talked to her? She must be so embarrassed. I hope this doesn't affect her work." Every sentence looked like support on the surface, But the underlying message was always the same. Trouble follows her. When I approached Elena with my suspicions, she shrugged as if the subject exhausted her. Maybe it was him, maybe it wasn't, she said. In the end, it doesn't matter. The damage is already done. They might punish someone, but no one can unsee what they've seen or unsay what they've said. She sounded tired, not of this one incident, but of the pattern as a whole. A few days later, Marcos stopped by my desk, leaning against the partition with manufactured casualness. I heard you're pretty close to Elena these days, he said, as though he were commenting on the weather. Just be careful, okay? Situations like this, they can pull other people in, and you've got a good future here. He smiled kindly, as if he were giving me brotherly advice, not warning me to keep my distance. That was the moment I realized that staying by her side was not just an emotional decision. It was a choice with consequences. I could nod, step back, and watch from the safety of the crowd. Or I could stand where I was and make it clear that I would not pretend neutrality while someone destroyed her little by little. I chose. I looked Marcos in the eye and said, "The only situation I see is a colleague being attacked. I'm more worried about what it says about this place if everyone decides to look away." His smile tightened, then snapped back into its usual pleasant shape. It was enough to know he had heard me. Elena started to fade before anyone knew she was thinking about leaving. It began with harmless absences. She skipped group lunches, turned down after-work drinks, kept conversations short. Then the change deepened. She began sending emails at unusual hours, as if she were quietly clearing her plate. She volunteered for tasks that would make handovers easy. It was the behavior of someone folding up their life, preparing to walk away without leaving loose threads behind. I watched all of this happening and felt the tug of war inside me. Part of me wanted to respect her space, to avoid pushing her into a corner. Another part knew that silence was exactly what had allowed her shame to grow unchecked for so long. One evening, after the office had emptied out, I found her alone, staring at a spreadsheet without really seeing it. I asked, plainly, if she was planning to quit. She kept her eyes on the screen for a long moment before answering. "I'm thinking about stopping being the problem for people who insist on standing near me," she said softly. It was not drama. It was a statement of how she saw herself, not as someone under attack, but as the source of the trouble. That hurt more than any email ever could. From that day, I made a point of involving her, not as charity, but because she was good at what she did. I insisted on her name being attached to key presentations, made sure executives knew exactly which ideas were hers, not mine. I did it openly, so that no one could mistake my loyalty for hesitation. She accepted the work, but there was still distance in her eyes, as if she were waiting for the moment I would finally decide that being close to her was more trouble than it was worth. Then something small happened that changed everything for me. We were reviewing numbers at my desk when she reached into her bag to find a USB drive. As she rummaged through keys and receipts, a metal keychain slipped out and clinked onto the table. It was nothing special, just a worn piece of metal with a date engraved on it. That date hit me like a slap. It was the exact day of a fire in the building where I used to live years earlier. The fire that almost trapped me on the upper floors. The night when someone on a lower level had smelled smoke, seen the first lick of flame, and pulled the fire alarm before any of us upstairs realized what was happening. The report I'd received afterward mentioned that early alarm as the reason no one died. I had never known who that person was, until I saw that date sitting between us on her keychain and heard her say, almost without thinking, "I keep this to remind myself I survived." I did not say anything right away, but the coincidence circled my mind like a hawk. What if our stories had crossed before we ever shared a coffee at work? What if the scar she hated so much was connected, in a way neither of us understood yet, to the reason I was alive to say, "I'm not going anywhere"? The idea would not let me sleep. That night, I dug out an old folder from a box in my closet. Reports, letters from the building administration, emergency documentation from the fire. The official note was still there. An unnamed tenant had triggered the alarm as soon as they noticed the smoke. No names, only initials. Those initials, now that I looked at them, matched Elena's full name. Back then it had meant nothing to me. Now it drew a straight line between us. The next day, I invited her out for coffee away from the office. Not in the break room with its humming machines and half-heard conversations, but in a small cafe down the street. She hesitated, then accepted. We sat by the window, the world passing by outside, and I told her about that night in my building. The smell of something burning, the siren shrieking before the smoke reached the upper floors, the confusion and fear as we all poured out onto the street. She listened carefully, brow furrowed, fingers curled around her coffee cup. When I mentioned the date, she went still. When I said that the report referenced a resident on a lower floor, she looked away, towards something only she could see. Then, slowly, she told me her version. After her accident, she had stayed with a relative in that building while she recovered. That night, she had been awake when she smelled smoke and saw the orange flicker in the hallway wiring. Heart pounding, she had pulled the alarm and then locked herself inside the apartment, shaking, reliving the horror of flames all over again. For everyone else, it was just a scare, she said quietly. For me, it was like the universe trying to repeat the same story. She had never been praised or even formally thanked for that act. To her, it was simply another memory filed under things that hurt. I laid the old document between us on the table and showed her the initials. If I'm right, I said, then the person who pulled that alarm might be the reason I'm here today. Sitting in front of you, saying dumb things, bringing you coffee, refusing to disappear. It was a strange, fragile moment. There were no violins, no dramatic flashbacks. Just the quiet realization that the scar she saw as a curse was attached to a life that had rippled out in ways she never imagined. She stared at the paper, then at her hands, then at me. So you're telling me, she said slowly, that this, she touched her chest lightly, is connected to the reason you're alive? I nodded. Maybe not directly, but the road that gave you that scar also placed you in that building, on that floor, at that time. You didn't just survive. You made sure other people did too. Maybe me among them. For the first time since she had shown me her scar, I saw something different in her expression when she thought about it. Not acceptance, not yet, but a crack in the old certainty that it only represented loss. For a long time, she had believed her body was proof that she scared people away. Now she had to consider another possibility, that the same story also held the reason why, years later, someone was stubborn enough to stay. The company meeting that followed a few weeks later was the kind that makes everyone dress a little better and sit a little straighter. Management was going to announce structural changes, new goals, and, most importantly, a promotion that everyone had been speculating about, a new leadership position with real weight. The rumors had narrowed the candidate list down to two names, Elena's and Marcos's. The entire staff squeezed into the conference room, the air thick with perfume and expectation. Executives lined up at the front and delivered the usual speeches about growth and challenges and the future of the company. At some point, the head of HR stepped forward with a carefully neutral smile and announced that, after careful consideration, the promotion was going to Elena. There was a ripple through the room. Some people clapped immediately, others followed a beat later when they realized there was no alternative outcome to support. I glanced at Marcos and saw his jaw tighten for just 1 second before his expression rearranged into one of professional approval. Elena stood up, smoothed her clothes with practiced calm, and walked to the front to say a few words. She could have kept it safe. She could have thanked everyone, promised dedication, repeated a few buzzwords, and stepped down again. Instead, she took the microphone, let the room settle, and decided to reclaim something that had been taken from her weeks earlier. Thank you for the trust, she began, eyes scanning the audience. Most of you know me through my work, the reports, the presentations, the long emails that fill your inbox at odd hours. A soft wave of laughter passed through the room. She let it die down. What some of you also know, though not because I chose to share it, is that there is another version of me you've recently seen or heard about through an image that circulated where it never should have. The room grew still instantly. No one shifted in their seats. I'm not going to describe that picture, she continued. What I will say is this. I have a scar on my body. It's the result of an accident that nearly killed me years ago. That scar has meant a lot of things over time. It has been a reminder of trauma, of fear, of everything I lost. It has also, whether I liked it or not, influenced how some people looked at me and how I looked at myself. Her voice stayed steady, even as a few people lowered their eyes. What I didn't know until recently, she went on, is that the same path that gave me that scar also put me in a position to help others survive. I won't go into details, because the story isn't only mine. But I will say this. I am done apologizing, silently or otherwise, for the mark that saved my life and might have saved someone else's. She let that line hang in the air. The silence that followed felt different from the hush of gossip. It was heavier, more thoughtful. On the executives' faces, I saw a mix of surprise and respect. On Marcos's, a flash of something like frustration, quickly hidden. By speaking plainly, she had forced everyone to choose whether they would keep participating in quiet cruelty or move on. The company backed her publicly, reinforcing the stance against harassment. No one said Marcos's name, but several people seemed suddenly less impressed by his polished charm. Elena returned to her seat without a victorious smile or dramatic flourish. She sat down, breathed out slowly, and folded her hands in her lap. She had won more than a new title. She had, in front of everyone, reclaimed the right to exist without shrinking herself to fit other people's comfort. Little by little, life settled into a new rhythm. The scandal that had once dominated every whispered conversation faded into the background, replaced by deadlines, new clients, and the everyday frictions of office life. People referenced the official memo more than they mentioned the email. When they spoke of Elena, it was increasingly about her leadership style, her decisions, the way she handled tough meetings, not about the rumor that had briefly turned her into a spectacle. Her relationship with her scar did not transform overnight. There were still mornings when she dressed in front of the mirror and had to fight the old instinct to hide. There were still days when a careless comment or a lingering look dug up old fears. But there was also something new, the knowledge that at least one person had seen the entire story and chosen to remain. My promise, tested by gossip, cruelty, and professional risk, had not broken. We did not leap straight into a fairy tale romance. Real life doesn't work that way. Instead, we started with small, real steps. Long conversations on the office rooftop after everyone else had gone home. Shared dinners that weren't tied to work events. Silences that felt comfortable instead of tense. Sometimes we argued. Sometimes she pushed me away out of habit, convinced I would eventually get tired. Each time I stayed. Each time, she allowed herself to believe just a little more that "I'm not going anywhere" was not just a line under a streetlight. If I am telling you all this, it is because there are more people like Elena out there than we realize. People carrying visible or invisible marks they have been taught to see only as shame. Scars, illnesses, past mistakes, stories that others turned into weapons. The world can be cruelly efficient at convincing someone that they are the problem, that their very presence creates trouble, that the kindest thing they can do is disappear. But a scar is not a verdict. It is evidence that something tried to end you and failed. Sometimes, as in her case, it is also a sign that you were in the right place at the right time to pull an alarm, make a call, hold a door open, and that someone else is breathing today because you stayed. I owe my life, in ways I will probably never fully understand, to the path that left that line across her skin. I still see her sometimes on the rooftop after a long day, leaning on the railing with the city lights stretching out below. She doesn't fuss with her shirt as much anymore. Sometimes the outline of the scar is faintly visible through the fabric when the wind catches it. I walk up beside her, and she gives me that half-amused, half-serious look. "You sure you're not going anywhere?" she asks, as if testing the words. And I answer with the same sentence, now carrying everything we've lived through. "I'm not going anywhere." If you've stayed with this story up to this point, maybe it touched something in you. Maybe you carry your own marks. Maybe you know someone who keeps theirs hidden. If so, remember this. The moment someone gathers the courage to lift their metaphorical shirt and show you what they're most afraid of, you have a choice. You can look away, change the subject, add another layer to their shame. Or you can do the hardest, simplest thing in the world. You can stay.